investigators finally believed they had enough evidence to act. This was the moment they had been waiting for a very long time. If they succeeded, they would expose one of the most sophisticated criminals Canada had ever faced. If they failed, Gerald might disappear once again, just as he had done so many times before. Search warrants were executed.
You are under arrest.
Investigators moved into locations. Years ago, Canadian police were hunting a mysterious criminal who had stolen millions of dollars and repeatedly bypassed security systems that were considered impossible to defeat. What frustrated investigators the most was that, while the manhunt was still underway, the man was traveling around the world, living like a millionaire, and even seemed to enjoy mocking the people trying to catch him. Then one day, investigators uncovered a shocking truth. The man was not only behind a series of daring thefts across North America, he was also suspected of stealing one of Austria's national treasures. So who exactly was Gerald Blanchard? And how did a boy fascinated by electronics become one of the most notorious master thieves in Canadian history? To answer that question, we have to go back to where it all began. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss more incredible true stories like this one. Before becoming the target of international law enforcement agencies, Gerald Blanchard was just a boy with an unusual fascination for machines and electronics. Gerald Blanchard was born in 1974 in Canada. From an early age, he loved taking things apart to understand how they worked. Whether it was simple electronic gadgets or more complex devices, Gerald was always more interested in what was inside than simply using them like other children. People who knew Gerald later in life often described him as intelligent, quiet, and deeply curious. While many kids preferred sports or outdoor activities, Gerald could spend hours studying electronics, locks, and mechanical systems that most people never paid attention to as a young boy. Gerald moved with his family to Omaha, Nebraska in the United States. It was during this period that his life began to change. In Omaha, he encountered a completely different environment. His passion for technology remained, but he also became attracted to something new. IT was the thrill of overcoming things that other people believed were impossible. First, the challenges were small. Gerald enjoyed figuring out how to open locks that others couldn't. He wanted to understand how security systems worked and whether they could be fooled. To most people, a locked door meant they were not supposed to go any further. But in Gerald's mind, every lock was simply another puzzle waiting to be solved. As time passed, that curiosity continued to grow. Gerald no longer wanted only to understand how systems worked. He wanted to prove that he could defeat them. That was the beginning of a path that would eventually turn Gerald into one of the most notorious thieves in Canadian history. At the time, however, no one could have imagined what was coming. Not even Gerald's family realized that these seemingly harmless hobbies were slowly developing the skills that would later help him carry out heists that would frustrate police forces across several countries for years. And before long, his curiosity no longer stopped at locks or electronic devices. Gerald began testing himself against real targets that could bring money, and targets that would become his first steps into the world of crime. As Gerald Blanchard entered his teenage years, he began to realize that the skills he had taught himself could offer more than just the satisfaction of solving problems. He was no longer interested only in opening locks or understanding how alarm systems work. Gerald began asking himself a different question. If I can bypass these layers of security, could I make money from it? That was when everything started to change. First, Gerald's offenses were relatively minor. But unlike most street thieves, he never acted impulsively. Before doing anything, he would spend time observing, memorizing, and planning. What made Gerald different was his patience. While others wanted immediate action, Gerald could spend days or even weeks studying a target. He watched how people entered and exited a building. He noted when security guards changed shift.
Get home safe.
He studied the locations of cameras and the blind spots that few people noticed. For Gerald, a heist didn't begin with a break-in. It began long before that. This habit allowed him to succeed repeatedly without attracting attention. Each time he managed to overcome a security system, Gerald became more confident. The feeling of victory became addictive, not because of the money, but because it made him feel smarter than the people who had designed the system. Over time, Gerald began to believe that almost every system had a weakness. IT was simply a matter of finding it. IT was an extremely dangerous way of thinking. Because once someone believes they can always find a flaw, they constantly seek greater challenges. And Gerald was no different. Small targets gradually stopped exciting him. The money from petty thefts was no longer enough to satisfy his growing ambitions. He wanted more, he wanted bigger jobs. He wanted to prove that he could defeat systems that people considered impossible to break. By then, a new target had already appeared in Gerald's mind. If he could understand how banks and ATM machines worked, could he get the money inside without using force? That question would open the next chapter of Gerald Blanchard's life. A chapter in which the amounts involved would no longer be measured in hundreds or thousands of dollars, but in hundreds of thousands. And it was from this point onward that the name Gerald Blanchard slowly began to attract the attention of investigators. As Gerald Blanchard entered early adulthood, he no longer sought the thrill of overcoming small challenges. What attracted him now was money. Not a few $100s or a few $1,000s, but amounts large enough to completely transform his life. While most criminals chose to rob banks with guns or by threatening employees, Gerald thought differently. He believed that every system created by humans contained weaknesses. If he could identify the weakest link, taking the money would be far easier than confronting guards or police officers face to face. That way of thinking led him to a target that existed almost everywhere, yet few people paid much attention to it: the ATM. Most people saw an automated teller machine. Gerald saw a safe standing in the middle of the street. He began studying how banks replenish cash, how technicians serviced the machines, and how money was transported from one location to another.
I said, listen,
the more he learned, the more he realized that the greatest vulnerabilities were often not technological at all. They lay in human assumptions and routine. Gerald spent months observing. He memorized schedules, identified the quietest hours at different locations, and studied every procedure connected to the flow of cash. Only when he felt he understood the system completely did he begin to act. The results exceeded his expectations. His first operations went so smoothly that almost nobody realized anything had happened until the money was already gone. Success after success made Gerald increasingly bold. Every large payout encouraged him to devote even more time to learning new techniques and refining his methods. Money began flowing in faster, and his lifestyle changed with it. The man who had once spent entire days surrounded by electronic devices now appeared in expensive clothes, drove luxury cars, and traveled constantly. To outsiders, Gerald looked more like a successful young businessman than someone living off stolen money. But beneath that glamorous image, a dangerous problem was quietly taking shape. Every victory convinced him that he was smarter than the people trying to catch him. Every escape from suspicion pushed his confidence even higher. The most dangerous thing was not the amount of money Gerald was making. The most dangerous thing was that he was beginning to believe he was almost impossible to catch. That belief changed everything. Instead of continuing to target familiar sources of cash, Gerald started looking towards something more symbolic. He no longer wanted to prove that he could steal money. He wanted to prove that he could take anything he desired. And before long, a famous historical jewel located thousands of miles away from Canada caught his attention. It was at that moment that Gerald Blanchard began preparing for the boldest operation of his entire life. By the late 1990s, Gerald Blanchard had acquired everything most criminals could only dream of having: money, experience, confidence, and perhaps most importantly, a profile that was nearly invisible to law enforcement. To many people, this would have been the perfect time to stop and enjoy life. But Gerald saw things differently. For him, the value of a heist was never just about the money. What fascinated him even more was the feeling of conquering things that other people believed were untouchable. That mindset eventually led him to Vienna, capital of Austria. There, he became interested in a famous piece of jewelry known as the Sisi Star, an artifact associated with Empress Elizabeth, one of the most beloved figures in Austrian history. It was not just an ordinary diamond. It was a historical symbol, part of the nation's heritage, an object recognized by millions of visitors. To most people, stealing it was unthinkable, but Gerald did not see it as jewelry. He saw it as a challenge. The more he learned about the artifact, the more fascinated he became. Not because of its monetary value, but because of its reputation. If he could take the Sisi Star and disappear without being caught, it would be the ultimate proof that he could overcome any security system placed in front of him. From that moment on, the preparation began, and no one knows exactly how much time Gerald spent studying the target. But investigators who later worked on the case believed that this was far from a spontaneous act. He studied the location where the artifact was displayed. He studied the way it was protected. He studied the internal routines and procedures inside the building. Every small detail was carefully memorized. While tourists came to admire the exhibits and take photographs, Gerald observed everything through the eyes of someone searching for weaknesses. Day after day, a plan slowly took shape, and eventually the moment to act arrived. In 1998, in the heart of Vienna, one of the boldest thefts of modern history was set into motion. and no one knew that within a matter of hours, the entire country of Austria would be shocked by the disappearance of a national treasure, and Gerald Blanchard believed that he was about to accomplish something no one had ever done before: to steal history itself and vanish without leaving a trace. He wanted to disappear before anyone even realized something had happened. When the artifact was taken, no one immediately noticed. Employees continued working as usual. Visitors kept walking through the exhibits. Life around them went on like any other day. Until the truth slowly emerged. The Sisi Star was gone. The news spread quickly. Investigators were called in. Security personnel were questioned. Every protection procedure was reviewed. One question appeared in everyone's mind. How could such a famous treasure disappear from a place that was supposed to be so heavily protected? Over the following days, investigators tried to find any clue that might lead them to the culprit. They examined the scene, interviewed witnesses, and analyzed every possibility. But the results were almost nothing. No clear suspect, no confession, no investigative lead that seemed truly convincing. While authorities struggled to solve the mystery, Gerald had already left long ago. He continued living his life as if nothing had ever happened. And what the police did not expect was that the theft in Vienna was only a very small part of the criminal world this man had built. Years later, when investigators began putting the pieces together, they realized they were not simply hunting a jewelry thief. They were facing one of the most sophisticated criminals Canada had ever produced. After the disappearance of the Sisi Star, Gerald Blanchard did not immediately become the subject of an intense manhunt as many people might assume. In reality, most investigators at the time did not even know who they were looking for. The case in Austria remained an unsolved mystery. While Gerald continued living his life on the other side of the ocean, this would also become the most dangerous stage of his criminal career, not because the police were close to catching him, but because repeated success was beginning to convince Gerald that he was almost untouchable. The money earned from previous operations completely transformed his lifestyle. International trips became more frequent. Luxury hotels, expensive cars, and extravagant parties gradually became part of his everyday life. To people who met him at social events, Gerald looked more like a successful businessman than someone living off criminal activities. That contrast made investigations far more difficult. On the surface, he was polite, well-dressed, and knew how to make a good impression on others. Few people could connect that image with a string of crimes that was causing so many headaches for law enforcement. What made Gerald even more unusual was that he did not spend money like ordinary criminals. He understood that suddenly displaying too much wealth could attract unwanted attention. As a result, he spent most of his time maintaining the image of someone who had become successful through business and investments. However, behind that carefully crafted image, new plans were constantly taking shape. Whenever he was not attending social gatherings or appearing among crowds, Gerald spent hours studying his next target. Maps, security diagrams, schedules, and information related to valuable assets continued to fill his days. For Gerald, money was no longer the only motivation. What he pursued now was the feeling of victory. Every time he defeated a security system, he felt as though he had beaten the people who created it. That mindset gradually turned into a dangerous habit. Instead of becoming more cautious after each successful operation, Gerald began accepting greater and greater risks. That was the moment when confidence slowly transformed into overconfidence. While Gerald was enjoying his luxurious lifestyle, investigators in Canada were beginning to notice something unusual. At first, incidents appeared scattered across different locations. Each case seemed unrelated. But as the files continued to pile up, a few investigators realized that the crimes shared remarkably similar characteristics. The perpetrator always prepared meticulously, rarely left behind useful evidence, always understood the target before taking action, and usually disappeared before the victims even realized what had happened. The first pieces of the puzzle were beginning to emerge. Although no one yet knew where the name Gerald Blanchard would eventually lead them, some investigators had already begun to believe that they were no longer dealing with separate crimes. Somewhere out there might be one person behind all of them, and the real hunt was about to begin. In the early 2000s, Gerald Blanchard still believed he was in complete control. His previous operations had brought him money, a reputation in the underworld, and the feeling that he was always one step ahead of law enforcement. The more he looked back at what he had accomplished, the more convinced he became that his methods were superior to any security system he had ever faced.
This vintage is
But on the other side, some investigators were beginning to see a much larger picture. Instead of treating each case as an isolated event, they started comparing files. The more they studied them, the more they noticed the same patterns appearing again and again. The perpetrators seemed to spend enormous amounts of time preparing before taking action. Targets were carefully researched. Everything was carried out quickly and methodically. Then the person behind it all vanished before investigators had time to make real progress. What caught the attention of investigators most was the level of skill possessed by the person behind these crimes. This was not the kind of criminal who acted on impulse or seized random opportunities. Whoever was understood technology, understood security procedures, understood how the police worked, and more importantly, understood how to think ahead of the people chasing him. Piece by piece, the puzzle began to come together. Meetings that lasted for hours became increasingly common. Files from different jurisdictions were brought together. Investigators shared information to determine whether they were pursuing the same person. Meanwhile, Gerald had no idea how serious the situation had become. He kept traveling, kept maintaining his social connections, kept enjoying the life he had built. Years of success had slowly caused him to underestimate his opponent. It was a mistake many intelligent criminals had made before. They were not defeated by a failed operation. They were defeated by the belief that they could never fail. As his sense of security grew, Gerald became increasingly bold. Some acquaintances later recalled that he always displayed tremendous confidence. He enjoyed being seen as the smartest person in the room. He loved the feeling of triumph over systems that others respected and admired. But somewhere among the thousands of pages of investigative documents being analyzed, his name had begun appearing more frequently than ever before. At first, it was just a small detail, the clue that seemed insignificant, a piece of information buried among dozens of other files. Yet those tiny details are often what change the direction of an investigation. The investigators still did not have enough evidence to act. They could not obtain an arrest warrant. Nor could they say with certainty that Gerald Blanchard was the man they were looking for. But for the first time in many years, the hunt had a specific name. And from that moment on, the distance between Gerald and the people pursuing him began shrinking little by little. While Gerald still believed he was free, investigators had quietly entered the most dangerous stage of all: surveillance, evidence gathering, and waiting for a mistake, because no matter how perfect a plan may seem, all it takes is a single crack in the chain for an empire built over many years to collapse in an instant. For years, Gerald Blanchard had built his reputation on patience. He studied his targets before taking action, planned his escape before a job even began, and always tried to erase every trace after each operation. It was this method that allowed him to avoid the attention of law enforcement for such a long time. But there is one pattern that often appears in major criminal cases. When success lasts too long, caution begins to fade. Gerald was no longer the young man who once spent weeks simply observing a target. A life of luxury and a string of victories had convinced him that he could control every situation. That was when riskier decisions began to appear more frequently. While Gerald enjoyed the rewards of his success, investigators in Canada continued quietly gathering information. They still lacked enough evidence to bring the case to an end, but new leads were beginning to emerge. At first, they were nothing more than small details scattered across different files. But once those pieces were put together, they gradually formed a clearer direction for the investigation. What made the situation dangerous for Gerald was that he had no idea any of this was happening. He still believed he was ahead, still believed that the people chasing him were far away from the truth. But on the other side, investigators had begun narrowing their list of suspects. Some names were eliminated. Some leads reached dead ends. And gradually, the name Gerald Blanchard started appearing more frequently in discussions. But he was not yet enough to prove his guilt. It was not yet enough for an arrest warrant. But for the first time in many years, the investigation had a specific target. The deeper investigators looked, the more they realized they were dealing with an unusual opponent. This person possessed technical knowledge, understood how security systems operated, and was exceptionally skilled at hiding his activities. Meanwhile, Gerald continued expanding his double life. On the outside, he projected the image of a successful businessman. On the inside, he carried countless secrets that he believed would never be uncovered. What Gerald failed to realize was that the distance between him and the investigators was no longer as great as it once had been. After years of following one small clue after another, the people hunting him could finally see light at the end of the tunnel. And if their suspicions were correct, a major raid could happen at any moment. Gerald Blanchard continued living his everyday life without realizing that the situation had changed. In his mind, the operations from his past had been hidden carefully enough that no one would ever be able to trace them back to him. Years of avoiding arrest only strengthened that belief. Behind the scenes, however, investigators were no longer treating each case as a separate incident. Files that had once been scattered across different jurisdictions were brought together into a single investigation. Every new document added another piece to a picture that was gradually becoming clearer. What caught their attention was not one decisive piece of evidence, but a pattern that kept appearing across multiple cases. The person responsible always prepared carefully, understood the target before striking, and usually disappeared immediately after the job was done. Those characteristics led investigators to the same conclusion. The person behind these crimes was most likely not a large organization. IT was an extremely intelligent individual. As the scope of the investigation narrowed, covert surveillance operations began. The information gathered was not yet enough to make an arrest, but it allowed law enforcement to understand much more about the man they were pursuing. The more they learned, the more they realized how enormous the gap was between Gerald's public image and his real life. On one side was a well-dressed, sophisticated man attending elegant social gatherings. On the other side were years of secrets buried beneath the surface. Meanwhile, Gerald still believed everything was unfolding according to plan. He had no idea that the people hunting him were closer than ever before. After years of patience, they had finally reached the moment they had been waiting for, and as search warrants were being prepared, the entire empire Gerald had spent years building stood on the verge of collapsing in a single night. After years of surveillance, investigators finally believed they had enough evidence to act. This was the moment they had been waiting for a very long time. If they succeeded, they would expose one of the most sophisticated criminals Canada had ever faced. If they failed, Gerald might disappear once again, just as he had done so many times before. Search warrants were executed.
You are under arrest.
Investigators moved into locations connected to Gerald, hoping to find the evidence they had been chasing for years. What they discovered immediately showed that this was no ordinary suspect. Valuable assets, electronic equipment, documents, numerous pieces of evidence linked to previous criminal activities. With every item seized, the overall picture became clearer. Throughout the investigation, law enforcement had always suspected that behind the image of a successful man existed an entirely different world. Now those suspicions were slowly becoming reality. For Gerald, this was the most dangerous moment since entering a life of crime. Secrets hidden for years were suddenly at risk of being exposed. The thing that had made him successful was his ability to stay in control. But for the first time in a very long time, that control was beginning to slip away. However, the biggest surprise for investigators had yet to come. Among the evidence they recovered were clues connected to a famous case that had once troubled the entire nation of Austria, the theft of the Sisi Star. After nearly a decade shrouded in mystery, the investigation had finally seen its first ray of hope. As investigators continued analyzing the evidence seized during the raids, a shocking discovery slowly emerged. The new leads were connected not only to thefts in Canada, but also pushed the investigation far beyond the country's borders. Every sign pointed to Vienna, the historic piece of jewelry that had disappeared in 1998, 4 years. No one knew exactly what had happened to the Sisi Star after it vanished from its display. Some believed the jewel had been sold on the black market. Others thought it had been smuggled to another country and would never be seen again. The truth turned out to be completely different. As the evidence was pieced together, investigators reached the conclusion that the man behind the theft was Gerald Blanchard. The revelation stunned many people, not only because of the fame of the jewel itself, but because of the way the crime had been carried out. For nearly 10 years, one of Europe's most famous thefts had remained unsolved. Now, the answer had finally emerged through an investigation that had originally begun with completely different crimes. For Gerald, this was the heaviest blow of all. The operations that had once made him proud were now becoming evidence against him. His victories from the past were coming back one by one. And the final confrontation with the justice system was no longer far away. After years of cultivating the image of a man who was always one step ahead of law enforcement.
Don't react. The jury is watching your every move, Gerald. Just stay calm.
This screen shows the calculated destruction of these machines. A trail of evidence leading directly to Mr. Gerald's feet.
Gerald Blanchard finally had to face the consequences of his actions. Charges were filed. The evidence collected during the investigation was gradually presented in court. The curtain hiding Gerald's double life was completely pulled away. The man who had frustrated police agencies across several—
Your Honor, I formally plead guilty to the charges against me.
Several countries could no longer control the game the way he once had. In 2007, Gerald Blanchard pleaded guilty to multiple offenses involving theft and fraud. He was later sentenced to prison. The luxurious lifestyle, the trips around the world, and the feeling of victory that had lasted for years finally came to an end behind prison walls. Looking back at the entire story, what made Gerald different was not only what he stole. It was the way he did it. He did not rely on violence. He did not build a criminal empire through intimidation. Instead, he relied on intelligence, patience, and an extraordinary ability to find weaknesses in systems that other people trusted, but those very strengths eventually became the cause of his downfall. The more successful Gerald became, the more convinced he was that he could never be defeated. The more he escaped investigations, the more willing he became to take greater risks. In the end, what brought down one of Canada's most notorious master thieves was not a perfect security system. It was the belief that he was always smarter than everyone else. And that is how the story of Gerald Blanchard came to an end, from a boy fascinated by electronics, to the man who stole a national treasure, and finally, to a name that appeared in investigative files spanning many years, on a journey filled with boldness, but also a reminder that no one can outrun the consequences of the choices they make forever. Many years after the case came to an end, the name Gerald Blanchard continues to appear in investigative records, books, and documentaries about famous criminals, not because of the amount of money he stole, and not only because of the theft of the Sisi Star. What makes his story different is that Gerald revealed an unsettling reality. No matter how advanced security systems become, they are still designed by human beings. And anything created by humans can contain flaws. For many years, Gerald made a living by finding those flaws. He studied more than most people. He observed more carefully than most people. He was more patient than most people. Had he chosen a different path, Gerald could have become a cybersecurity expert, a security consultant, or a successful entrepreneur. That is also why many investigators later admitted that the case left them with a sense of regret. They were not chasing an impulsive or ignorant criminal. They were chasing a man with genuine talent. But instead of using those abilities to build something meaningful, Gerald chose to exploit weaknesses for personal gain. In the end, all the victories he had once been proud of became evidence inside a criminal case file. The secrets he had hidden for years were gradually brought into the light. The luxurious travels came to an end. The daring operations became memories of the past. And the man who had frustrated police agencies in several countries ultimately had to face the consequences of his own decisions. That is why the story of Gerald Blanchard is still remembered today. Not only is the story of a master thief, but as the story of a man gifted with extraordinary intelligence who chose to use it in a way that sent his life down a completely different path.